On the morning of December 25th, 2024, Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 took off from Baku, bound for Grozny. But just as it neared its destination, something went terribly wrong. Passengers reported a sudden explosion, shrapnel, tearing through the cabin. In the cockpit, the pilots, struggling to maintain control, reported what they believed was a bird strike. They were turned away from Russian airports and forced to divert toward Kazakhstan. Minutes from safety, the aircraft crashed near Aktau, killing 38 people. Days later, shocking evidence emerged. This was no accident. A Russian surface-to-air missile may have been responsible. Was this a tragic mistake or was something being covered up? December 25th, 2024. A cold winter morning at Aliyev International Airport in Baku, Azerbaijan. Dozens of passengers board Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, a routine commercial flight bound for Grozny, Russia. The aircraft, an Embraer 190, is a reliable workhorse for short-haul flights, operated by experienced pilots who have flown this route dozens of times. There is no indication that this journey will be anything but routine. At 7:55 a.m. Azerbaijan time, Flight 8243 lifts off from the runway. In the cockpit, Captain Igor Kishnyakin and First Officer Alexander Kalyaninov begin their climb to cruising altitude. The flight is scheduled to take just under 2 hours. Passengers settle in, some watching the sunrise over the Caspian Sea, others dozing off as the aircraft smoothly makes its way toward Russian airspace. But 40 minutes into the flight, something strange happens. The pilots notice that their GPS navigational aids have stopped working. The aircraft's ADS-B transponder, which sends real-time location data, also disappears from tracking systems. The crew contacts Russian air traffic control to report the issue, requesting an alternative approach to Grozny. But this isn't the first time pilots have encountered GPS interference in this region. For years, flights passing through Russian airspace, especially near conflict zones, have reported jamming and signal disruptions. These tactics, used primarily to counter Ukrainian drone strikes, are known to affect civilian aircraft, but without GPS, navigating through the heavy fog covering Grozny airport becomes far more dangerous. At 8:50 a.m., air traffic controllers clear Flight 8243 for its first landing attempt. Visibility is near zero. The runway lights barely pierce through the dense fog. The pilots attempt an approach but quickly realize they cannot see the runway. They abort the landing, climbing back into the sky for another attempt. At 9:10, they try again. This time, they descend lower, hoping to spot the runway before reaching the decision altitude, the critical point where pilots must either commit to landing or abort. But the fog is relentless. Once again, they cannot see the ground. Captain Kishnyakin calls for a go-around. The plane ascends sharply, engines roaring as it climbs away from Grozny. At this point, the pilots make a difficult decision: return to Baku. It's the safest option. But as they begin their turn away from Grozny, disaster strikes. Passengers later recall a loud blast echoing through the cabin. Some say they felt an impact. Others describe a sudden jolt, as if the plane had been struck by an invisible force. In the cockpit, alarms blare. The pilots immediately suspect a bird strike, a common hazard in aviation, especially at low altitudes. At 9:16, the pilots report a control failure. They tell air traffic control that a bird strike has damaged the cockpit and request a diversion to Mineralny for the airport. But upon hearing that weather conditions there are also poor, they change course again, this time toward Makhachkala, Dagestan. Minutes later, at 9:22, they report a hydraulics failure. The aircraft is becoming harder to control. Flight 8243 is now crippled, its systems rapidly failing. At 9:25, the pilots declare an emergency, squawking 7700 on their transponder, a universal distress signal. But instead of being guided to the nearest available airport, they are met with silence. According to later reports, Russian air traffic controllers deny the crew permission to land at any airport in Russia. Instead, they are ordered to continue flying south toward the Caspian Sea. But why? At the time, no official explanation is given. But later investigations suggest that Russian officials wanted the aircraft out of their airspace, possibly to avoid a scandal. If the plane crashed in Russian territory, it would be impossible to suppress the truth. But if it went down over water, evidence could disappear forever. With no other choice, the pilots turned the crippled plane toward Kazakhstan. They have one last chance to save their passengers, an emergency landing in Aktau. But the damage is worse than they realize. The aircraft is bleeding hydraulic fluid, its control surfaces barely responding. As they struggle to keep it airborne, time is running out. Flight is now in a race against death. Flight is in crisis. The aircraft has been struck mid-air, but the pilots don't yet realize the full extent of the damage. They still believe they are dealing with a severe bird strike, a devastating but survivable emergency. At 9:49 a.m. Azerbaijan time, the pilot requests an emergency landing at Aktau International Airport in Kazakhstan. It's their last hope, but as they steer the aircraft toward the Caspian Sea, the situation worsens. Hydraulics are failing. Control is slipping. The Embraer 190 has 3 hydraulic systems, all running through the aircraft's tail and wings. If all 3 are lost, the plane is virtually unflyable. Pilots in this situation have only one remaining tool: adjusting engine thrust to keep the plane level. It's a last resort, and few have ever survived with it. But Captain Kishnyakin doesn't give up. He fights to keep the aircraft stable, knowing that 67 lives depend on him. At 10:02 a.m., the flight enters Kazakh airspace. Seconds later, its ADS-B signal reappears for the first time since the explosion. Air traffic controllers in Aktau are watching the aircraft's erratic descent. Altitude fluctuates wildly, first dropping, then climbing, then dropping again. The pilots are struggling. Kazakh emergency teams rush to prepare the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances are already waiting, along with paramedics and airport staff. They know what's coming. At 10:07 a.m., the aircraft passes over the Caspian Sea. From the ground, people in Aktau look up and see the plane rocking violently, barely holding together. Inside, chaos unfolds. The cabin is full of smoke, screams, and panic. Passengers who were hit by shrapnel are bleeding, some unconscious. Flight attendants shout commands, trying to keep order. Seatbelts tighten. Oxygen masks hang from the ceiling. The pilots have one goal: get the plane down in one piece. At 10:25 a.m., flight lines up for its first attempt at landing. The runway is in sight. The pilots extend the landing gear, but as they descend, the aircraft veers left. Control is slipping again. The nose pitches up and the engines roar as they abort. Go around. The plane climbs, shakily turning to attempt another approach. They don't have much time. Fuel is running low. Systems are failing. If they miss this next attempt, they may not get another. At 10:28 a.m., the aircraft makes its second turn toward the runway, but suddenly radio contact is lost. At 10:29 a.m., the plane is still circling, desperately trying to line up with the runway. Witnesses on the ground see the aircraft shaking violently. At 10:30 a.m., it happens. The right wing clips the ground first, sending the aircraft into a catastrophic tumble. The plane breaks apart on impact. The explosion is instantaneous. Flames erupt from the fuselage as the front half of the plane disintegrates. The tail section, however, remains largely intact, flipping upside down before coming to a halt. Survivors in the rear scramble to escape, some pulling others from the wreckage. Thick black smoke rises into the sky as emergency responders arrive just 5 minutes later, desperately working to control the flames. By 11:05 a.m., the fire is extinguished, but the damage is done. Of the 67 people on board, 38 are dead, including both pilots. A 13-year-old boy is the youngest fatality. Many of the survivors are in critical condition, suffering from severe burns, head trauma, and fractures. As the sun rises higher over Aktau, a tragic truth begins to emerge.
Turning overseas now, and survivors of that horrific Christmas Day plane crash speaking publicly for the first time. And the investigation continues amid growing questions.
The crash site isn't just an accident. Investigators soon discover holes punched through the fuselage, metal fragments lodged inside the tail. Something else brought this plane down. Emergency teams work tirelessly, searching for survivors and recovering bodies. But as investigators approach the twisted remains of the Embraer 190, they notice something highly unusual. Holes, dozens of them, punched clean through the fuselage. Bird strikes don't do this. Within hours, aviation experts, military analysts, and journalists begin to question the official narrative. Did Flight 243 collide with a bird mid-air, or was something far more sinister at play? The first major red flag appears when authorities recover the aircraft's tail section. Unlike the rest of the plane, which was incinerated in the explosion, the tail remains largely intact, and it tells a story. Investigators find shrapnel embedded in the stabilizer, tiny, twisted metal fragments, consistent with an external explosion. These aren't normal impact marks. They look like the result of a high explosive fragmentation warhead. Then, a crucial detail emerges from passenger accounts. Survivors describe a loud explosion and a sudden jolt, far too powerful to be a bird strike. Some passengers were physically injured by shrapnel, with metal fragments lodged in their bodies. Again, this doesn't happen with birds. The most telling clue comes from the flight data itself. ADS-B tracking shows that the aircraft's GPS signal was jammed just before the incident. Electronic warfare interference, a known military tactic, was active in the area. Slowly, a picture starts to form. Flight 243 wasn't just an accident. It was caught in the crossfire of an active conflict.
We start this hour with developing news on the plane crash in Kazakhstan. Reuters is now reporting that 4 sources in Azerbaijan say the aircraft was downed by Russian air defense systems.
For months, Russia had been defending its airspace from Ukrainian drone attacks. Multiple Ukrainian UAVs had targeted Grozny, and Russian air defense systems had been firing missiles to intercept them. On December 26th, just one day after the crash, a bombshell report surfaces. Azerbaijani officials reveal that they found evidence that a Russian Pantsir-S1 surface-to-air missile may have struck the aircraft mid-flight. The Pantsir-S1 is a short-range air defense system designed to shoot down drones, cruise missiles, and low-flying aircraft. It uses radar-guided missiles and high-explosive fragmentation warheads, the exact type of weapon that could produce the shrapnel damage seen on the flight. On December 27th, The New York Times publishes its own report. Azerbaijani investigators believe, without a doubt, that the flight was hit by a Russian missile. But Russia denies everything. The Kremlin remains tight-lipped. No official statement, no explanation. Instead, Russian media and government agencies double down on the bird strike theory, insisting that there's no proof of an attack. But there's one problem. The evidence keeps piling up. On February 4th, 2025, Kazakh investigators make a shocking discovery. Among the wreckage, they find a fragment of a Pantsir-S1 missile, lodged deep inside the fuselage. The truth is now undeniable. Russia had shot down a civilian airliner. As the evidence mounts, diplomatic tensions explode. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev publicly accuses Russia of a cover-up, demanding an apology, prosecution of those responsible, and financial compensation for the victims' families. Moscow, however, refuses to acknowledge guilt. Instead, Vladimir Putin issues a vague apology, calling the event a tragic incident and blaming it on Ukrainian drone activity in the area. But he never admits responsibility. Meanwhile, NATO, the United Nations, and major aviation bodies call for an independent investigation. Aviation experts warn that this is the most serious downing of a civilian aircraft since Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. And just like MH17, the truth is being buried under layers of denials and political maneuvering. By now, the truth is clear. Flight was hit by a Russian missile. Investigators have found Pantsir-S1 missile fragments inside the wreckage, and forensic analysis confirms the damage is consistent with an anti-aircraft weapon. But instead of taking responsibility, Russia begins its cover-up. In Moscow, officials scramble to control the narrative. The Russian Ministry of Defense denies any involvement. State-controlled media outlets push contradictory explanations. Some claim a bird strike, and a few even suggest a Ukrainian drone attack brought down the plane. But Azerbaijan isn't buying it. On December 28th, Russian President Vladimir Putin personally calls Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev. In a carefully worded statement, Putin apologizes for the tragic incident, but stops short of admitting Russia's role. Instead, he blames Ukrainian drones attacking Grozny and claims Russian air defenses were simply repelling threats. But Azerbaijan demands more. On December 29th, Aliyev publicly accuses Russia of a cover-up, calling its initial explanations delirious versions meant to confuse the truth. He demands a full admission of guilt, prosecution of those responsible, and financial compensation for the victims' families. Russia refuses to respond. At this point, the global aviation community is watching closely. Did Russia just commit another MH17 style shoot-down? In response, Azerbaijan rejects Russia's offer to have the investigation conducted by the Interstate Aviation Committee, a Moscow-led organization. Instead, Baku insists on an independent, internationally recognized probe. Then, another shocking detail emerges. According to Azerbaijani officials, after the missile hit the plane, Russian air traffic controllers refused to let the pilots land anywhere in Russia. This raises a disturbing question. Did Russian authorities deliberately force flight out of their airspace? If the plane had crashed in Russia, investigators would have found missile fragments immediately. But by forcing the pilots to divert toward the Caspian Sea, there was a chance the aircraft would crash into the water, destroying crucial evidence. As Russia stays silent, global outrage grows. NATO calls for a full investigation. The United States says it has early indications that Russia is responsible. The European Union compares the crash to Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. In Washington, White House officials begin discussing sanctions. The idea? Hold Russia accountable for shooting down a civilian aircraft, just like after MH17. At the same time, behind closed doors, Russia is making desperate attempts to quietly settle the issue. On December 27th, reports emerge that Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, tried to personally contact Aliyev. He offered financial assistance to the victims' families, an attempt, some say, to buy Azerbaijan's silence. But Aliyev refuses the offer. He wants accountability, not hush money.
Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev has accused Russia of mistakenly firing at an Azerbaijan Airlines passenger jet before it crashed.
By January 6, 2025, Aliyev takes his strongest stance yet. In a televised address, he directly blames Russia for shooting down the plane, calling it an act of gross negligence and accusing Moscow of covering up the truth. Meanwhile, the investigation is nearing its final conclusion. Even though the physical evidence is undeniable, key questions remain. Was Flight 8243 truly mistaken for a threat? Or was there another reason the aircraft was targeted? Why did Russian authorities refuse the pilot's request to land? Will Russia ever be held accountable? As of now, no Russian official has admitted responsibility. No one has been punished. And the Kremlin continues to deny, deflect, and delay. One thing is certain, the downing of Flight 8243 is not just a tragedy. It's a warning. Because as long as commercial planes continue to fly near active war zones, this won't be the last time it happens. The global game of cat and mouse continues.